On this panel will be Colin McDonnell, who is a director at SOA, and SOA is Self-Organised Architectural Research, GLC, and Colin is also principal at Found Architecture. Actor and writer Aoibhinn McCann, who is also a member of the National Campaign for the Arts Steering Group, and the panel will be chaired by the CEO of First Fortnight, who we heard earlier on, Ireland's Mental Health Arts Festival. That's Maria Fleming. Maria, of course, has over 20 years' experience working as a general manager, producer, programmer, and arts consultant with Ireland's leading companies and theatre artists. And Maria, of course, is also the chair of the National Campaign for the Arts. And I think that this topic will also bring up many subjects, some of them upsetting, and some of them, I hope, enlightening. So I'll ask Maria, Colin and Aoibhinn to come to the stage.
You're more important than me. Thank you, Sean. So the National Campaign for the Arts, I think probably everybody in the room knows who we are, but we are a volunteer-led grassroots movement campaigning to make the case for the arts in Ireland. And at this point of the day, first of all, congratulations to us all for getting to here. It's been a long day with a lot of information, some of it quite distressing. But at this point, I thought it might be interesting just to share a couple of pieces of information of why we're here and why the arts matter. So I pulled on two pieces of research that I discovered over the last number of years. And one is a piece of research that was done in the UK through UCL. And it discovered that attendance at arts events over a month, over 3 times over a month for people over 50 prolongs their life. So that's fairly staggering. So it proves what we already know, that the arts gives life to us. And another piece of research from the New Victory Theatre in New York, which is a theatre for young audiences. They did a longitudinal study working with young people from disadvantaged areas of New York, and similar to the basic income, they had a control group. And there was one group of children who were given access to the performing arts and a group of children who did not have access to the performing arts. And the children who had access to the performing arts gained hope. Now, there were a number of other things that happened that they discovered as a result of that, but the thing that really struck me and catches in my throat, as you can hear every time, is the fact that what we do can give children hope. So that just puts in context why we matter, what we do matters. The panel that we have today, I just want to say that I'm aware for some of the artists in the room, this could be triggering. I think a lot of today has been triggering for people, and it's great that this was preceded by Minding Creative Minds presenting. And I would like to say, if anybody is impacted by anything that they've heard today, do contact Minding Creative Minds, or if you want to contact the NCFA, we'd be happy to signpost you on to places. So yes, spaces for the arts is what we're looking at, but primarily housing. And you might say, well, why housing at an arts conference? And the reason for that is that thanks to the wonderful work that's been done, the research that the Minister has insisted on, along with basic income, we now have really good information, statistics, data that we cannot ignore, which shows that within the general population, 67% of people own their own home. Within the arts community, that goes down to 33%, which means that the arts sector is disproportionately impacted by the housing crisis and by a rental sector that's really in difficulty. Daft.ie put out stats last month that within the entire country last month, there were 2,000 properties available to rent. So it's really stark, and that's impacting people in our sector. At our most recent NCFA meeting, we did a Menti survey with one of those fabulous things where the words pop up, you know, what is impacting you the most? What do you want NCFA to focus on? And housing was number 1, basic income was number 2, and climate was number 3. So today is very relevant to our membership. The basic income research has just been invaluable in so many things. And one of the things that we see referenced frequently in the quotes today is mental health. And the NCFA have just closed a survey that we called on our members to complete. It just closed on Friday. And as I mentioned earlier, I spent the weekend going through some of the responses. And I literally had to step away from the computer multiple times. It was really distressing to read some of the circumstances that some of our members are experiencing. And so much of their mental health difficulties related back to housing insecurity, and that's why this is important. But the NCFA are a solutions-focused organisation, so we try and identify problems that are impacting artists in Ireland. We look for the solutions, and then we campaign to the policymakers or funding organisations that can impact the change that's required for that problem we've identified. And I think it's really encouraging to hear the Minister talking today about going to bat for us at Cabinet for issues such as basic income. When I was campaigning on the Waking the Feminist campaign, we met the first female general in the Irish Defence Forces, and she gave us a vital piece of information. She said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So thank you, Minister, for being at the table for us. So as a result of our survey that we found and looking for solutions, we have been in contact with Colin MacDonald, and part of the solution, we're not going to solve the housing crisis, but we're looking for where are the areas where we could make an impact and make a positive impact as soon as possible for artists who have housing insecurity. And one part of that solution could be possibly cooperative housing or community land trusts. So we've spoken to Colin, who is an architect and who has experience in this area. As somebody mentioned in a panel area, look for the expertise when we don't have it. So somebody from our arts community who is an architect has some possible solutions to share with us, and I'm going to ask Colin to share on that now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invitation, and I found it very inspiring so far, actually, and I hope I can contribute something interesting and useful to this. I'll also say I've got a lot of slides, more than I need, so I will skip through some of them, so don't be alarmed if slides are going past quickly. Also, actually, sometimes I find it useful to have information up here that in a discussion afterwards, if we have a conversation, there's information there that I can come back to and that we can talk about in a bit more detail. So just to give you a very brief introduction, I'm the director, as you heard, of an organisation called Self-Organised Architecture. And our mission has really been to try and push the development of what we now call community-led housing in Ireland. So we've been around since 2018, and our work has really kind of broken down since then into sort of 3 strands of work, which you can see at the bottom on this slide, which are supporting pilot projects, supporting policy development, which takes a lot of research and advocacy, and also doing sort of public awareness type work. And I guess the reason we came together initially, and we were a group of about 8 people to begin with, is that we traveled around mostly Europe, seen the possibilities for housing that sort of sits outside what we might see as the main strands of housing that exist in Ireland right now. We would see them principally as private provision or developer provision and state provision in its many forms. And in a way, community-led housing can be a third strand, which can be added to that. In Ireland at the moment, it's starting to kind of crawl forward a little bit, and there's still quite a lot of work to do. But it's, I think, really useful just to give a general overview of what that is, talk about some of the possibilities as they exist elsewhere, and then talk about some of the progress that we've made to date here. So community-led housing actually does have a definition in UK law. I won't go through it because there's 3 slides with 3 different points that define it. But I think it's probably easiest for me to just explain it as community-led housing is housing that's provided by a community or a group of people for their benefit or for the benefit of their wider community. And that can be a really small group of friends. It could be a professional group. It could, in the instance that we may be talking about today, be a group of artists. It could be something much wider. It could be a community which represents a particular geographic area, and maybe there's difficulty for local people to acquire affordable housing in that area, and the general community in that area say, we're going to get together and we're trying to make sure that the people in this community that are in need have housing. So those things all fall within this kind of general bucket of community-led housing. So some of the main important aspects of this are that there's agency for the people involved, that it's affordable. Being non-speculative is a really important aspect of this. Participative design is really important. Often the people who are being housed are present in the project at the very start, so they're not just having housing delivered to them. And now, increasingly, we're seeing it as something that can provide more than housing. So it can provide spaces for community, it can provide spaces for social enterprise, for culture, spaces for food growing in nature, all kinds of things. There's different models, and often these can overlap within the one project. I'll talk a little bit today about cooperative housing and community land trusts. Co-housing is something which kind of can exist, and in some of the projects I'll show it does exist, and I'll explain it a little bit. And self-help housing is, I won't actually really talk about that today, but I can maybe, if there's any questions about it, I can come back to that. So cooperatives, I won't say too much about what a cooperative is. I think probably people have a general idea of what a cooperative is. There's what are known as 7 cooperative principles, which are there on the screen. Usually a cooperative organization would try and have those principles embedded in its activities. So traditionally, cooperatives have been legally formed as an IPS, which is an industrial provident society, but now more often they might be a company limited by guarantee, such as our organization is actually a company limited by guarantee, once these principles are written into the company constitution. So essentially it's a member organization, and usually it's an organization where members can pool their resources for mutual benefit. That's the basic idea of what a cooperative is. And I think artists are probably in some way familiar with cooperatives from maybe gallery co-ops, studio co-ops. I don't want to say too much about those because I'm sure there's people here that know much more about this than I do. They're essentially types of workers' co-ops. And I think in Ireland, in a lot of cases, these types of organizations, studios, galleries, they might operate like a co-op, but not actually maybe be formally incorporated as a co-op, but it kind of functions in the same way. And they may get some funding from local enterprise offices or the Arts Council. They're essentially sort of business endeavors, I guess. But an expansion on that idea is the housing cooperative, which is a cooperative where similarly people pool their resources if they can't provide housing for themselves individually, or they want a type of housing which is not the type of housing that you can just get on the market or through social housing provision. They pool their resources and they become a member of a co-op, and through those resources sort of supplemented with additional funding, which may be bank loans, it may be state grants, it may be crowdfunding and funding from friends and the wider community. Somehow you gather the money together to develop housing for yourself, and that can be maybe refurbishing an existing building in a city, maybe building something new. So that's the general idea of what a housing cooperative is, and it sort of meets those same 4 criteria of agency, affordability, potentially participative design. And often case in, say, there's different models, but for example, in, say, a shared equity co-op, if we on the stage here were members of a co-op, we might buy a share at a certain price to begin with, which is your equity that you put in. The gathered equity allows the co-op to make an investment and get loans. Usually you would pay an affordable rent as well. If you ever leave the co-op, you sell your equity or sell your membership share onto the incoming person. So it's an affordable type of housing, essentially. So I'm going to show you some versions of this existing elsewhere. This is a project I put in because I think people might be aware of it anyway. It's called House for an Artist in London. Our House for Artists. This is actually not a cooperative, interesting enough, but I think one interesting thing about it is that it was funded through arts funding in London by Create London. And it provides space for artists to live with affordable rents. And I guess the quid pro quo for those affordable rents is that artists provide a community arts program on the ground floor of the building. It's sort of what they give back for this. So the space, it does have, one of the aspects of community-led housing I mentioned there was co-housing. So co-housing is kind of a sharing of resources within housing. And it can be sharing of lots of things, or it can be just sharing a small parts of your resources. So you can see there's like very big balconies in this, which kind of encourage a community kind of vibe within these spaces. So it's a really interesting project, which I can come back and show you more of. This is a project in Berlin called R50. R is for Ritterstrasse 50. If anyone's in Berlin, they can visit it there. It's a Baugruppe model, which is it's a model given that name in Germany. It's a group of people that come together. They form a company to develop a building, get the loans that they need. And the apartments in this building are slightly more owned outright individually by each member of that building. But it's interesting that all of those members were there to begin with. They all had a say in the design. You can see here organizational diagrams. You can't read it obviously at this scale, but I think you might get the idea that each dwelling in that had a very specifically designed organization internally. So every person moving in could have their own space. And there's also like really nice common spaces in this building too. A building here, Spreefeld in Berlin, also in Berlin. This is a cooperative, this building, and it's a big mix of different uses of apartments in this. There's actually 3 buildings, one left and right and center there. They really wanted to keep the garden in the middle and the waterfront open to the public, which is maybe not something you would have in a commercial development. There was self-help construction elements built into this, so people were able to come in and self-complete apartments. There's community and workspaces in the ground floor. Interestingly, there's apartments which are called cluster apartments. This is the dining space in one of those where I was lucky enough to be invited to dinner at one stage. This is, you can imagine it like a lot of sort of smaller bed sits which give on to shared, very big kitchen, very big living room, and then somebody makes dinner every night. So this is kind of a co-housing kind of environment, but within a cooperative. You might say, well, that sounds a bit like student accommodation, or sounds like co-living. But the big difference is these people own this. So they're not renting. It's not a for-profit structure. So if you want to live like this, you can own this and have this affordably and not be at the whims of a developer. This is the ground floor meeting space. This is the workspace that they have. Final building I'll talk about is called La Borda. It's in Barcelona. This is also cooperative. It was funded through cooperative banks, which maybe are most similar to our credit unions here. And an interesting thing about this is that it was supported a lot by the Community Land Trust, which I'll say a little bit more in a minute. But a Community Land Trust enabled this cooperative to get a long-term, low-cost lease from the city of Barcelona. And the city of Barcelona has embraced that idea in the last 5 or 10 years as being a central plank of its provision of housing. This is the same building. I believe it's like the tallest, at least tallest residential timber building in Spain. This is the cooperative or participative design process you can see here. So why are these projects, why do they work in Europe? And I guess there's a few points that maybe give an understanding of that there's maybe a bit more of a cultural understanding of cooperative housing, collective housing. It's recognized as a form of affordable housing, so it can be funded as such. In Ireland, it's a bit more difficult, very difficult, in fact, to have a group which self-selects itself and then receives funding. So a bit like the question that people might ask about the minimum basic income for artists, like why these people? Why should you get money? And that's a question that's faced by co-op projects that start here. Funders will say, well, why you? Why don't you just go on the housing list? So there needs to be a sort of a change in the view of these type of housing, that if they, I guess, meet certain criteria, if the people within them meet the criteria of social or affordable housing income brackets, that it should be funded as a form of affordable housing. There's other issues as well. Commercial banks will lend to this type of project in Europe. There's low interest finance available from state banks and leasing of public land, as I said. So all of these things don't exist in all of these countries, but some of them do in each place, which makes things a bit more easy. And an example of a project in Dublin, which is a failed project, unfortunately, was ABCD, which maybe someone here has heard of this, Artist Building Cooperative Dublin. They sort of started after the crash. The last I heard from them was around 2018, 2019. And they had that problem where when they looked for funding, the funder said, well, why should we give money to you and not to nurses or something like that, you know? And it's an understandable response, but also something that maybe with a kind of view change can become a different response in the future. So I'm going to end by talking about something a bit more positive. So Cork Community Land Trust is a project we're involved in with other people working this sector in Cork. So a community land trust, what is it? There's a definition also in English law, which I won't go through, but I'll explain it probably quickly if I can. A community land trust is an idea where a community comes together, forms a legal entity which owns land, and then the community democratically decides what to do with that land. And most commonly it's used for affordable housing for people in that community that are in need. And it emerged first in the civil rights movement in the United States, took off in the really 70s, 80s and 90s there, so there's hundreds there now. And then across the Atlantic, probably in the 90s, in England and Wales particularly, there's over 300 CLTs now. It's expanding to Europe. We in SOA have participated in some European funded projects to expand the reach of the CLT in Europe. It's actually Interreg Northwest Europe funding, which we received, so it's the Northwestern European countries. So land is owned by a community. The idea in terms of affordability, and legally this works differently in different places, but just at a very basic level, the idea is to decouple the price of land from the price of housing. So if you buy a house in a CLT or a co-op takes land in a CLT, it needs to pay for its building, it doesn't need to pay for the land. And the housing price bubbles, things like that, the crazy prices of houses are generally to do with the land price, not the building price. Buildings will depreciate like everything else, they'll lose value, but land just perpetually raises in value. And then also in these organizations, governance is really important to balance the naturally kind of competing interests that you will always have in any large community. So a typical governance structure might be a tripartite one, like you see here, where public authorities select a third of the seats on the board of the CLT, residents in CLT homes select a third, and then civil society or the wider community selects the other third of the board. And that can be anyone, usually on a particular geographic area, such as in the case of Cork Community Land Trust, anyone living in that geographic area will be able to become a member. And this is a diagram which is a bit hard to see, but the idea of decoupling the price of land and houses is something that through the legal connection between the house and the CLT, at every subsequent sale of that house, so someone might buy a house affordably the first time, if they sell in 20 years' time, that house is price controlled the next time, it's price controlled the next time. So it's what we call it is perpetual affordability, which is really good because a lot of affordable housing goes on the market, ends up expensive for the next buyer. So Cork Community Land Trust is essentially setting up a community land trust in Cork City. We want to do more than housing, as I said. I guess interesting maybe for people here, like we really want to support cultural spaces as well. And we recently received grant funding from Interreg again through my organization, but we're spreading, it's one full-time position for the next 5 years, which is actually brilliant, but we will be stretching it as far as we can. And we're partnered with Cork City Council on that project, which is brilliant, and a number of other actors in different European cities. So Cork is a pilot city, along with 2 cities in Belgium and 2 cities in France. And the goal, one of our goals is to provide one CLT home during that time, a demonstrator home. But really more important for us is just to use that funding to get Cork Community Land Trust off the ground. And hopefully, within a year's time, it should be the first CLT incorporated in Ireland. And I also want to say, actually, from previous work we were doing, that the CLT, the Community Land Trust, has actually been written into Irish law. It's in the Affordable Housing Act. It's mentioned as an entity that a local authority can deal with in the provision of affordable housing. But since then, there's been nothing else has been done since then. It's just sitting there. So, but I think it still enabled Cork City Council to work with us more easily on this project. And I'd also say this Interreg funding, typically they provide 60% of your funding and then you match fund 40%. So we're still looking for a small bit of that match funding. If anyone here would like to talk to me about this project later, I'd be very happy to tell you all about the huge benefits that will come out of it. So also important in this project, things like stewardship, being a good ancestor is really important because it's a really long-term thinking type concept. And it was really gratifying to hear these things coming up earlier in the discussion. And circularity is really important. So next steps for community-led housing in Ireland, I think that the model is recognised, that low-interest finance becomes available, feasibility stage grants, public land leasing would be brilliant, any of these things. And I'd say to groups that are setting up housing, work together with other groups because it's difficult, and once one pilot project gets off the ground, I think more will follow. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much. Sorry, I left you a minute and a half.
Thank you, Colin. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. Like what we've seen there is like an Irish model, some international models, and we've seen examples of rental projects, home ownership projects, but also the thing that was really exciting for me, what I learned from, was like the project in the UK that's funded through arts and not funded through housing. So is there a possibility for us to work with local authorities and with the Department of the Arts to get something up and going in Ireland? I'm going to come to Aoibhinn.
Sorry,
I'm going to speak very fast. No, so Aoibhinn, as well as being a member of the steering committee for the National Campaign for the Arts, is an artist with, I suppose it's fair to say, lived experience of dealing with housing. And Aoibhinn is going to share very kindly both her own lived experience, but some of the responses that we got back from our survey.
It feels like we've been talking about this all day, though, so it's not news to us about, you know, all of the different anecdotal evidence, I guess, at this point that's coming through from our survey that we closed on Friday. Personally, I had to move out of Dublin in order to have a decent personal life, and I think a lot of artists, like I'm an actor and a writer now. I've been an actor for 10 years, a writer for the last couple of years, and a lot of us are feeling, and this seems to come up in the survey quite often, is the community, and community comes up, is obviously the centre of this architecture. The community will keep us sustained when we, you know, for me, for example, at the start of the year, for the first 3 months, I had no work whatsoever, and I was going to savings and trying to figure out how to maintain my life, the consistency in my life. This is a really big, vulnerable thing to say, but I've put off being a parent because of being an artist. Lots of actors and writers, artists of all of, throughout the art sector, we notice that they tend to put off parenthood. I think housing is at the centre of that. You don't want to bring a person into the world if you can't provide for them. There's a huge amount of that, and the stats are really stark. So some of the things that we kept coming up were isolation. We have less minus time. So what I guess I'm reinforcing is that on the steering group for the NCFA, this keeps coming up, and we are inviting everyone in the room to contact us, because we have to still define what we want to bring to policymakers this year. So if you can go onto our website, our social media, there are ways to contact the NCFA through the WhatsApp, through email. The survey is closed, but that isn't the only way to make your argument. Your personal stories are obviously personal, and they're up to you to share, but we are very, very careful with those. I won't go into too much more because we are out of time, but I guess my role today is to say we are here to communicate the needs and the asks of the sector, and this is clearly an important thing. And all of these amazing potential solutions will need huge policy change, it seems, in order for them to be successful in Ireland, and for community to be at the centre of it all, because we know that loneliness is a killer. And as we've kept hearing peppered through all of the different panels, that if you don't have your community, that is going to be, it's a huge loss to you and to your community. I personally feel like it's an absolute trek for me to try and support fellow artists in their work now, because I don't live in the city. The natural sort of ecological mix that you get when you live in your community, the reinforcement of your art form, the capacity to support your fellow artists, to be in the visual of your fellow makers, so that you may be considered for a role, in my case, or you may be considered for a position, are lesser now, I believe, across the island, because less of us are able to accumulate in a space. And that is, as we're hearing as well from our sector, it's having an impact on the nightlife in the country as well. Our nightlife, you could argue, we don't have the stats right now, is going, well, we do have stats, but I don't have them. It is decreasing in lots of ways. That's a bit of a vague statement, but I think you know what I mean. We're not able to maintain the richness of nightlife in the same way, because we're losing the makers from their cities. And that's what we're learning. that's my.
We put you under huge pressure
Well, I'm classically
there.
trained, so
Thank you.
hopefully that has its role
But
today.
we will, over time, share some of the information that we received, but it really was heartbreaking, some of the input that we got from our members, but it motivates us to work on your behalf and to be at the table and make decisions.